In our last session, we began to unpack something of what happens to believers when we die and link it into some of what we're now understanding about the end times and where the rapture and the resurrection fit together. Maybe you're still confused, that's okay. But what I want us to understand is that there is a place where believers need to give an account of how we've lived our Christian lives. As we continue to think about the end times, and we've seen how Jesus is coming back for his bride, the church, and that sense of the Bible speaking of us being called up with Jesus in the air, we've taken some time to refresh our memories about what happens when we die, and that sense of the souls of believers going to Eden, going to paradise, going into the eternal presence of God. What we also have to ask the question of, though, is what happens to the souls of unbelievers? What happens when they die? And again, I want us to refer back to some of the teaching that we did earlier on in the Bite-Sized Bible series when we looked at this question before. And if you remember back, we made it clear that the souls of unbelievers, they go immediately to eternal punishment. And I wonder if you've like me, ever sort of pondered the idea of, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? And when we come to the end times and we see that there is a resurrection of all, it's given once for man to die and then judgment. And we see that there is a judgment day for all. What happens to the souls of unbelievers when they die? To help us understand this, if we look back in the Old Testament, we'll see that regularly through the Old Testament, there's a Hebrew word used for the grave, which is Sheol. And in the New Testament, in the Greek, that's translated Hades. When the Bible speaks of death in the context of unbelievers, it talks about the grave, Sheol, Hades, as being a place where there's bodily decay. Peter referred to it in Acts 2 when he's giving his sermon on the day of Pentecost. But we also see that Jesus talked about this as being the place of punishment. And in Luke 16, we have the account of the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man and Lazarus both die. And we see this picture of Lazarus being taken into Abraham's bosom, into paradise, into that sense of Eden. But we see the soul of a rich man is in torment in Hades. And it's described as a place of torment. Jesus described it as a real place. And so if we think of Eden as a place where the souls of believers go, then is it possible that when the Bible's talking about Hades, this is the place where the souls of unbelievers go, prior to the resurrection on the last day? We can maybe unpack this a little bit further when we read verses like in Matthew 16, where Jesus is talking to Peter, and he says to Peter, I'm going to call you Peter, which means a rock. Previous to that, he was Simon. But he says, I'm going to call you Peter, and on this rock, on Peter, I will build my church, and all the powers of Hades will not conquer it. When Jesus is talking there, he actually uses the word Hades to describe some of the authority that Peter will have, that the church will have. If we turn to Revelation and we look at what Revelation has to say about that final day, that time of judgment, we see a number of things. First of all, if we look at Revelation 6, where we see the four horsemen of the apocalypse coming, we see that there's a distinction between death and Hades. We see this sense of the grave and Hades being highlighted as individual characteristics in Revelation 6. If we scroll forward to the end of the tribulation, when Jesus comes back and he's returning with all of his army, he's riding his white horse, and he has the victory over Satan and all of his plans, we see a few things. First of all, in Revelation 19 verse 20, we see that the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. Followed by the devil in Revelation 20 verse 10, he's then thrown into the lake of fire. And then in Revelation 20 verse 13, we see that death and Hades give up their dead, and anyone whose name is not found in the Lamb's Book of Life is thrown into the fire. There is a view that we can take from this, where we see, just as for believers we had Eden as a place of paradise where the souls go to wait for that resurrection where we get reconnected to a physical body, equally for the souls of unbelievers, it would seem that when Jesus was speaking about the rich man and Lazarus, and then we look at what happens in the end times with Hades, death and Hades being thrown into the lake of fire, there seems to be something about these having some control. It might seem a bit hard to get our heads round, but the Bible clearly teaches that there is a day of judgment for unbelievers. We spoke last time that for the souls of believers, when we have to give an account before God, it's about receiving a reward, receiving our crowns of how we've lived our Christian lives, what we've done with the trust that God's given us. But for the unbelievers, it's a very different story. And in Revelation 20, we see that following the millennial kingdom, there is death and Hades give up their dead. They give up these souls. And there is a judgment of unbelievers. And we see it's at this point where we could see the sheep and the goats being separated. It's at this point we can see that the souls of unbelievers are actually thrown into the lake of fire. The resurrected unbelievers go into the lake of fire. So we see that when the Bible speaks to the believers at the beginning of the millennial kingdom that they needn't fear the second death, it's a very different story for unbelievers. So it might seem hard to follow some of this, but what we see at the end of the end times, we see the end of the story where Jesus comes and when he rules and he overcomes the enemy, we see first of all the beast and the false prophet being thrown into the lake of fire. We see Satan being thrown into the lake of fire. We see death and Hades giving up their dead and being thrown into the lake of fire. And then we see the unbelievers whose name's not written in the Lamb's Book of Life also being thrown into the lake of fire. In other words, the Bible makes clear that for anyone who chooses not to put their faith in Jesus Christ, they share a common destiny with Satan and his minions. This should spur us on to realise that when we talk about being saved, we're actually being saved from an eternity. We have a message of hope to give to people. We have a message that's an urgent message that we need to say to people, flee the coming wrath, flee that destiny, because we have a destiny that is an eternal destiny in new heavens and a new earth, the recreated eternity. But our hearts should break over the lost, just as Jesus' heart beats, that none should perish and all should be saved.